The wagon wheel struck a stone and shuddered, and the sound rolled through the darkening valley like a warning. She gripped the seat rail. He said nothing, only tightened the reins and studied the ridge ahead, where the last light of an October sun bled orange behind pine and granite. They had been married 2 years. They had crossed 3 territories in 6 weeks. They had almost nothing left. The coin purse tucked inside her shawl held $11.40. She knew the exact sum because she had counted it that morning, and the morning before, and every morning since Nebraska, as if counting might make it grow. It did not grow, it only shrank. Clear Fork appeared below them as a scattering of lamplight, small and uncertain, hemmed by dark timber and the black thread of a creek. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked twice and fell silent. "We'll ask at the mercantile," he said. "Someone will know of land, a cabin, anything with a roof." She did not answer right away. Her hands had gone stiff with cold, and her stomach had gone hollow with something worse than hunger. Doubt sat beside her on the wagon seat like an uninvited passenger, and it had ridden with them for weeks. "And if there's nothing?" she asked. "Then we keep going until there is." The wagon creaked past the first buildings, a blacksmith's shed gone quiet for the night, a church with its door shut against the cold, windows glowing amber in a boarding house, where laughter spilled faintly into the street. None of it was theirs. None of it welcomed them. A man on the boarding house porch watched them pass, pipe smoke curling above his hat, and said nothing at all, which felt somehow worse than if he had spoken. They found the mercantile dark, its shutters latched for the night. A hand-lettered sign in the window read, "Closed," and beneath it, smaller, someone had scratched, "Try morning." Morning was hours away. The temperature was already falling, and their breath came out in pale clouds. He turned the wagon toward the edge of town, where the road thinned into a rutted track running along the creek. "There's supposed to be open land west of here," he said. "Past the old mill. We passed a man on the road 2 days back who mentioned it, said no one wanted it." "No one wanting it might mean no one should have it," she said. But there was no real argument left in her voice, only exhaustion wearing the shape of words. He reached over and took her hand, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The horses plodded on. The creek murmured beside the road, unseen in the dark, cold and constant, indifferent to the 2 travelers following its bank toward whatever waited at the end of it. Neither of them could see it yet. Not the fence posts leaning like old men, not the barn roof sagging under years of snow, not the pale shapes moving slowly through the meadow grass ahead. But the wagon rolled on, and the valley opened wider, and something in the darkness seemed almost to be waiting for them. The wagon wheels caught on a stone, jolting them both forward, and he steadied her with the hand still holding hers. Ahead, the track narrowed further, choked with weeds that scraped against the wagon's underbelly. She peered into the darkness, trying to make sense of shapes that kept shifting at the edge of the lantern light. Fence rails, she realized, though half of them lay flat in the grass like fallen soldiers. "There," he said, pointing. "A structure." The barn rose out of the gloom first, its roofline broken in the middle, where the weight of some past winter had finally won. One wall leaned inward, boards gray and split, and yet it stood, stubborn against collapse. Beyond it, smaller, sat a cabin with a chimney still intact, its stones dark against the paler wood. She said nothing. She had learned, in the weeks since they'd sold the last of their good furniture to afford this journey, that hope needed to be handled carefully, like a coal carried in bare hands. If she let herself believe too quickly, The disappointment would burn worse. He stopped the horses and climbed down, boots sinking into mud gone stiff with the evening's cold. He walked toward the barn, lantern raised, and she heard him make a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite dismay. "Cows?" he called back. "There are cows in here." She climbed down herself, skirts catching on the wagon step, and followed the light. Inside the broken doorway, shapes shifted and lowed softly, unbothered by the intrusion. 7 of them, she counted, their ribs showing beneath matted hides, but alive. Alive and standing in straw that hadn't been changed in what looked like a season or more. "Someone left them," she said, wonder cutting through her exhaustion. "Just left them here." "Or couldn't stay," he said. He held the lantern higher, studying the sagging roof, the walls that still somehow held. Whoever it was, they didn't take much when they went. They walked the perimeter together, saying little, cataloging what the dark allowed them to see. A stream ran behind the property, its voice louder here than it had been on the road, tumbling over stones unseen. The cabin door hung loose on one hinge, but the walls looked sound enough, chinked with mud that had cracked but not crumbled entirely. "It isn't ours," she said quietly, though something in her chest had already begun to shift, some small ember catching where none had been before. "No," he agreed, "but no one's filed on it that I can find record of, and it won't survive another winter empty." She looked at him in the lantern light, at the exhaustion etched into his face, the same exhaustion she felt in her own bones, and beneath it, something else, the same stubborn spark she'd married him for. "Neither will we," she said, "if we don't stop soon." He nodded slowly, turning back toward the barn, toward the cows shifting in the dark, waiting, as if they too had been hoping someone would come. Morning came gray and reluctant, light seeping through cloud rather than breaking it. She woke stiff in the wagon bed, every muscle protesting, and for a moment did not remember where she was. Then she heard it, the low complaint of a cow, close, patient, unmistakably real. She sat up. Through the mist rising off the meadow grass, she counted them. 1, 3, 5, 7. 7 cows, thin-flanked but alive, moving slowly through grass gone to seed, undisturbed by the strangers who had slept nearby. Their coats were dull, their hooves overgrown, but their eyes were calm, unafraid, as though they had simply been waiting for someone to remember them. He came around the wagon rubbing sleep from his face, and stopped when he saw her looking. "They made it through the winter on their own," he said, disbelief threading his voice. "No man, no fences worth calling fences, and they made it." "They're half-starved," she said, though even as she said it, she was already moving toward them, slow and steady, the way her father had taught her, long before either of them had ever dreamed of Idaho Territory. One heifer lifted her head, ears turning, but did not run. Someone cared for these animals once. They haven't forgotten how to trust a hand. He watched her a moment, then looked past her to the barn's broken roofline, to the cracked chinking on the cabin walls, to the fence posts leaning like tired old men along the meadow's edge. It would have been easy, she thought, for him to see only ruin, but he crouched instead beside a fallen rail, turning it over in his hands, testing the wood for rot. "This could hold," he said. "Most of it could hold." "Lucas," she said his name softly, and he looked up. "We have almost nothing left. No claim filed, no money for one, no house waiting for us anywhere else in this territory. I know it. But there's a stream here that doesn't quit, and there's grass enough for cattle, and there are 7 cows standing in it who don't look like they mean to leave." She drew a breath, feeling the ember catch fully now, spreading warm through her chest despite the cold morning. "I think this might be the only place in all of Idaho that's willing to have us." He rose, brushing dirt from his knees, and came to stand beside her. Together they looked at the crooked cabin, the sagging barn, the cows grazing as though this small ruined kingdom were the whole of the world. It was nothing. It was also, somehow, everything they had left to build with. "Then we stay," he said. "We mend what needs mending, and we make it ours in truth, even if no one else in this valley believes it's worth the trying." She slipped her hand into his, cold fingers finding cold fingers, and for the first time since the wagon wheels had turned onto that lonely road, she did not feel like a woman with nowhere to go. She felt like a woman standing on the edge of a home. The first fence post went in before the frost had fully lifted from the ground, and it fought her every inch of the way. She held the rail steady while he swung the mallet, his breath coming in white bursts, his knuckles split from the cold iron of the tools. By the second day her palms had blistered raw beneath the gloves, and still she gripped the wood, because the 7 cows would wander clean into the tree line if the fence did not hold, and they could not afford to lose even one. The barn roof was worse. He climbed it with a rope tied around his waist, and the other end lashed to a fence post below, testing each board before he trusted his weight to it. Twice the wood gave beneath him with a crack that stopped her heart in her chest, and twice he caught himself on the beam above, cursing softly, climbing back up before she could even call out his name. She passed him shingles from the ladder until her arms shook, and when the sun went down they sat together in the cabin's small light, eating cold beans from a shared pan, too tired to speak of anything but sleep. The milking room took the better part of a week. Years of neglect had left it thick with dust and old straw gone to rot, and she scrubbed the plank floor on her knees until the boards showed pale beneath the grime, until the smell of mildew gave way at last to the clean bite of lye soap. Her hands cracked and bled in the cold water, and she wrapped them in strips of cloth each night and did not complain, because complaining changed nothing and the work still had to be done in the morning. Word of their labor reached town before their fences were even finished, and it came back to them twisted into laughter. A man at the general store said the fools out at the old Hargrove place thought they'd struck gold in a barn nobody else wanted. A woman at the boarding house said 7 cows would flood them out of house and home with milk they'd never sell in a settlement this small, that they'd be pouring it into the creek by summer, sour and wasted, and serve them right for their pride. The words traveled on wagon wheels and church steps and drifted back to the homestead on the lips of a passing neighbor who meant no unkindness but delivered the sting all the same. She heard it standing at the well, bucket in hand, and felt the old cold creep back into her chest. That night, she repeated it to him by the fire, waiting for him to share her worry. Instead, he only turned a scrap of wood over in his hands, already shaping it toward some purpose she didn't yet understand, and said that a man could laugh all he liked at 7 cows, but laughter never once repaired a fence or patched a roof. Let them laugh, he said. There was work yet to finish, and the cows did not care what the town believed. The cows answered his patience before the town's laughter had faded from the air. By the second week of clover-fed mornings, their ribs had softened under new flesh, their coats gained a dull shine, and the milk came thick and warm into the pails, more than either of them had seen in a single morning's work. She remembered the thin trickle they'd first coaxed from hollow-sided animals barely a month before, and now the pails rang full before the sun had cleared the ridge. At first, the abundance felt like a blessing too large to hold. Then it became a problem with teeth. They filled every can they owned by the 4th morning. then borrowed 2 more from a neighbor who eyed them with open doubt. Still the milk came. She scrubbed out old crocks, a washtub, even a chipped wash basin, pressed into service as makeshift vessels, and still it was not enough. Lucas hitched the wagon twice a day, hauling cans over the rutted road into Clear Fork, but the general store bought only what it could sell before spoiling, the boarding house took a little more, and the bakery's order, though generous, could not swallow the surplus. By the 5th day, the truth arrived in the form of smell. She found it first, a can left too long in the corner of the springhouse, the milk inside gone thick and sour, curdled into something between shame and waste. She poured it into the grass behind the barn, watching it soak into the earth, and felt each drop as a small failure pressed against her chest. That woman's voice returned to her, unbidden. "They'll be pouring it into the creek by summer. Serve them right for their pride." And for one raw moment she believed it might be true. Lucas found her there, hands still damp, jaw tight with the effort of not weeping. He didn't offer comfort in words. He knelt, sniffed the emptied can, turned it over, and said only that spoiled milk was a lesson, not a verdict. They needed cold, he said, more cold than a springhouse shelf could give them, cold enough to hold a whole herd's abundance instead of a single day's need. She wanted to believe him, but exhaustion had worn her hope thin, and she said as much, that they were drowning in the very thing meant to save them, that 7 cows had become 7 mouths, shouting a fortune neither of them knew how to catch. He didn't argue. He simply lit the lantern, though evening had barely begun to settle, and told her there was ground behind the barn he hadn't yet walked in daylight, ground the old owner's fences seemed built oddly around, as though guarding something rather than simply containing cattle. She followed him more from stubbornness than faith, wiping her hands on her apron, the sour smell of ruined milk still clinging to her fingers as they crossed the darkening yard together. The lantern light swung small circles against the barn's back wall, throwing shadows that made the old fence posts look like sentries. She held her shawl tight against the evening chill, watching him crouch and run his fingers along the fence line, tracing where it curved sharply away from the meadow's natural edge, doubling back on itself for no reason she could see. "No rancher builds fence like this," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Not unless there's something worth keeping people out." She said nothing, too tired to argue, too curious not to follow. The hillside rose steep behind the barn, choked with brush the old owner had clearly let grow wild for years. Lucas pushed through it, lantern held high, and she trailed behind, her boots slipping on stones slick with moss despite the dry summer air. Then he stopped. A wall of fitted stone rose from the hillside itself, half buried in bramble, so old the moss had claimed every seam. A door, oak and iron-banded, hung crooked on its hinges but intact. He set the lantern down and pulled at the handle until the wood groaned and gave way. Cold air rolled out to meet them, not the mild coolness of evening, but a deep, biting chill that raised goose-flesh on her arms even through her sleeves. She gasped, stepping back instinctively, then forward again, drawn by disbelief. Inside, the room was small but dry, its stone walls sweating faintly with moisture, and beneath the floor she could hear it. Water, moving, low and constant, a stream running unseen through the hill's belly. The air smelled of earth and mineral, clean and sharp, nothing like the sourness that had haunted her hands all evening. "It's colder than the springhouse," she whispered, hardly trusting her own voice. "Colder than anything we've got," Lucas said, running his palm along the wall as if to confirm it wasn't some trick of exhaustion and hope. "Someone built this on purpose, dug right into the cold vein of the mountain. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the shelving carved into one wall, warped with age but still standing, built for exactly this purpose: storage, preservation, permanence. Whoever had raised the dairy before them had known what she and Lucas were only now discovering, that the land itself held the answer to the very problem drowning them. For the first time in days, something in her chest loosened. Not relief, not yet, but the shape of it, waiting just beyond reach. "If this holds through summer," she said slowly, "we could keep more than a day's milk. We could keep cream, butter even." Lucas looked at her, lantern light catching the exhaustion still carved into her face. But something else, too. The same spark that had carried them across 300 miles of prairie with nothing but a wagon and each other's word. "Then we'd best find out how much this hillside can hold," he said, "before the cows outpace us again." She managed at last, something close to a laugh. The next morning came gray and cold, but neither of them noticed it. There was too much to do, and for the first time since they'd arrived, the work felt like it was pulling them forward instead of dragging them under. Lucas started with the barn's scrap lumber, dragging boards out into the yard and studying them the way he used to study a map before a long haul. He had never built a churn before, but he'd watched enough of them turn in enough farmhouse windows to understand the bones of the thing: a barrel, a dasher, a lid tight enough to hold but loose enough to breathe. His first attempt split down the seam within an hour. His second held. By dusk he had two standing in the yard like solemn wooden sentries, and his hands were raw with splinters he didn't stop to pick out. Inside the cellar, she worked by candlelight because there was no window to spare and no time to wait for one. She had watched her mother make butter as a girl, half-remembered motions now called back through effort and stubbornness, skimming cream, letting it sour just enough, working it with a wooden paddle until her arms ached and the fat finally broke free from the milk in pale, trembling curds. The first batch was too soft, spreading like river mud. She salted it, pressed it, tried again. By the third attempt, it held its shape on the wooden shelf, like something worth being proud of. Cheese was harder. She had no recipe, only fragments. Something about rennet, something about warmth, something about patience she did not naturally possess. She experimented with vinegar first, curdling milk into soft, loose curds that she wrapped in cloth and hung from a nail to drain, the whey dripping steadily into a bucket below like a slow, honest clock. It was crude, but it was cheese, soft and mild, and when she finally tasted it, alone, in the cellar, candle guttering, she nearly wept at how ordinary and how miraculous it was. Lucas built shelving to hold what she made, driving pegs into the stone wall itself, where the mountain's cold breathed steadiest. He fashioned a crude press from an old cider frame he found rotting behind the barn, tightening it with rope and a lever until the curds inside compacted into something firm enough to age. Neither of them slept before midnight anymore. Neither of them complained of it either. Some nights they worked in the same small circle of candlelight, not speaking, simply existing shoulder to shoulder in the cold stone room, while the cellar slowly filled around them, rows of butter wrapped in cloth, jars of cultured milk, the first humble wheel of hard cheese resting on a shelf, like a promise neither of them dared name aloud yet. Outside, the cows kept giving more than the valley could use. Inside, for the first time, they were finally keeping pace. The days folded into a rhythm too relentless to call routine. Before the sky had even chosen its color, she was in the milking room, palms aching, pails ringing with that same steady rain of sound. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, he was already at the churn, arms burning, the wooden dash rising and falling until the cream broke into gold. There was no pause between the milking and the making, no space between the making and the selling. The cans went out. The cheese wheels stayed. The rows in the stone room grew. She lost track some mornings of what day it was, only that the cows needed her, the curds needed her, the ledger needed updating in the thin margin of time between supper and sleep. Her hands cracked from the cold water and the salt brine. His shoulders ached from lifting cans that seemed to grow heavier each week, though the milk weighed the same as it always had. It was the hours that made everything heavier. Still, neither suggested slowing. Neither dared to say the word. Rest? Aloud, as though naming it might undo the fragile momentum they'd built. Instead, they measured their progress in shelves. Another plank driven into the stone wall. Another wheel of cheese turned to age evenly, its rind hardening under the seller's breath. Another crock of butter packed tight and marked with the date scratched into the wood. The room, once bare and echoing, now held rows upon rows, pale wheels stacked like coins, jars gleaming faintly in candlelight, muslin-wrapped bricks of butter cooling in orderly lines. One evening, she stood in the doorway of the cellar and simply looked at it, the fullness of it, the order carved from nothing but stubbornness and cold stone. Lucas came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder, and for a moment they only breathed together in the hush of the mountain-cooled air. "We're not drowning anymore," he said quietly. She nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. It wasn't triumph exactly, more like the first solid foothold on a slope they'd been sliding down for weeks. But even as the shelves filled, the demand outside kept climbing faster than they could match it. The boarding house wanted more eggs of butter than she could spare. The bakery asked for cream twice a week instead of once. Every gallon they saved from spoiling seemed to summon 2 more requests behind it. They were no longer fighting only the cow's abundance. They were fighting time itself, the narrow hours of a single day stretched thin across churning, pressing, hauling, selling. That night, as she banked the fire and he checked the cellar door one final time, she caught him rubbing his eyes, blinking hard against the exhaustion. "We can't keep doing both jobs at this pace forever," she murmured. He looked at her, weary but resolute. "Then we'll have to get smarter," he said, "before we run out of hours." The answer came 3 days later, riding in on a stagecoach driver with dust on his coat and an empty tin cup he set on their table without asking. He'd tasted the butter at the boarding house, he said. Wanted to know where a man might get more of it for the coach in up the pass. Regular, dependable, every week, rain or drought. He didn't haggle. He simply asked what they could promise, and could they promise it every Tuesday. She looked at Lucas. Lucas looked at the driver. "We can promise it," he said, though she heard the calculation running behind his eyes even as he spoke. More cows to milk earlier, more hours bent over the churn, more trips down the cellar stairs with aching arms. The driver nodded once, shook hands like it was already settled, and rode off toward the pass with 2 cans of butter wrapped in cloth beside him. That single order changed the shape of their days. No longer were they simply trying to unload what the cows gave before it spoiled. Now there was a destination waiting for it, a wagon that would come whether or not they were ready. It was a different kind of pressure, sharper and steadier than the panic of surplus. It gave their work an edge, a rhythm they could plan around instead of merely survive. Then, less than a fortnight later, a different visitor arrived, a merchant from the railroad town, his boots too clean for the mud outside their door, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man used to being listened to. He'd heard, he said, of cheese made in a stone room cold enough to rival any ice house in the territory. He wanted to see it. She led him down into the cellar herself, past the rows of aging wheels wrapped in cloth, past the shelves Lucas had built plank by plank through sleepless nights. The merchant ran a thumb along one wheel's rind, sniffed it, broke off a corner, and let it sit on his tongue a long moment. "I'll take everything you can make," he said finally. "Standing order, bulk price, paid on delivery, first of every month." Lucas didn't answer right away. She watched him do the arithmetic in his head. More milk needed, more cheese pressed, more hands eventually, though for now it would still be just the two of them. "We'll need time to build up stock," he said carefully. "Take it," the merchant answered. "I've waited longer for worse cheese." When the wagon rolled away, the cabin felt suddenly too small for what had just happened inside it. She turned to Lucas, breathless, half laughing, half afraid of how quickly the ground beneath them was shifting. "We're going to need more cows," she said. He was already reaching for the ledger, already thinking 3 steps ahead, and more hands to help us tend them. The money came slow at first, then all at once, the way water gathers before it breaks a dam. She kept the ledger tucked in a tin box on the shelf, and every evening they counted coins by lamplight, stacking them into columns like fence posts. Cows first. They rode to 3 different homesteads that autumn, picking through thin, sorry herds until they found 6 sound animals worth the price, udders full, eyes clear. 13 cows now grazed the meadow, and the sound of it, the low, contented moving of so much life across the grass, still made her stop some mornings just to listen. The barn came next. Lucas tore off what remained of the old roof board by board and raised new rafters, squared and true, working through the shortening days until his hands bled and healed and bled again. She held the ladder, passed up nails, called out warnings when the wind caught a sheet of tin. By the time the first snow threatened, the barn stood taller than it had in 20 years, walls solid, stalls doubled, a hayloft that didn't sag when a man climbed into it. She turned her attention to the meadow itself. The wild grass had fed the cows well enough, but she'd read once, in a farming almanac traded for butter, that clover fattened milk yield and kept soil rich through hard winters. So through the last warm weeks of the season, she and Lucas walked the fields together, scattering seed by hand from cloth sacks slung across their shoulders, row after row, until their arms ached and their boots were crusted with dark earth. She pictured it greening the following spring and could hardly stand to wait. The dairy house rose last, closest to the stream, built with lumber Lucas hauled from the mill in town and a stone foundation he laid himself, learning as he went. Inside, real shelving replaced the makeshift boards, a proper churning room stood separate from the cheese press, and a covered walkway connected it all to the stone cellar, so no can of milk had to sit uncovered in open weather again. She hung a small window over the workbench so morning light would fall across the churns, and the first time she stood inside it, finished, smelling of fresh-cut wood and cold stone, she pressed her hand flat against the wall as if to feel the whole structure breathing. They stood together at dusk one evening, surveying it all. The barn, the thickening clover shoots, the dairy house glowing faintly with lamplight, and neither of them spoke for a long while. It didn't look like the ruin they'd found. It looked, finally, like something built to last, something waiting only for the next test the land would send. The test came sooner than either of them wanted. By June, The sky over Clear Fork turned the color of old bone, and no rain fell for weeks. Then no rain fell for a month. The creek that fed the neighboring ranches slowed to a trickle, and dust rose off the roads in choking clouds whenever a wagon passed. She noticed it first in the garden, the way the soil cracked despite her watering, and he noticed it in town, where men stood outside the feed store with grim faces, talking about wells gone dry and cattle too thin to sell. Their own spring, fed from somewhere deep in the mountain, never wavered. The stream ran cold and steady past the dairy house, and the clover they'd planted held its green like a stubborn secret in a valley gone the color of straw. She walked the fence line one evening and could hardly believe it. On one side, their meadow lush and humming with insects. On the other, a neighbor's pasture baked hard and silent, cattle standing listless in whatever shade they could find. Word spread fast, the way it always did in a small settlement. A rancher who'd once laughed loudest at their overflowing milk cans came to the gate one morning, hat in hand, asking, without quite asking, if his herd might drink from their stream. Lucas didn't hesitate. He waved the man through, and by week's end 3 more ranchers had come, leading thin cattle toward the only green grass left for 20 miles. Evelyn watched from the porch as the meadow filled with animals that weren't theirs, and felt something loosen in her chest, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, humbled gratitude that the land they'd fought so hard to heal was now healing others. The stone cellar became just as vital. As the heat pressed harder, milk soured within hours anywhere else in the valley, but their cave-cold room stayed exactly as it always had, breath-cold and steady no matter how the sun scorched the fields above. Soon ranchers were paying to bring their own cans down into the hillside, stacking them beside Evelyn's cheese wheels and butter crocks, grateful for a few more hours before spoilage claimed what little they had left to sell. Lucas built a second set of shelves just to keep the growing crowd of cans organized, murmuring wryly that he never imagined a hole in a hillside would become the most valuable room in the county. Evelyn laughed, but her eyes stayed serious, watching the parched hills beyond their fence line, thinking of how close they'd once come to having nothing at all, and how strange it was that the very thing that once seemed like too much milk, too much cream, too much work, had become the reason half the valley now leaned on them to survive. By August, the grazing fees alone had outpaced what they used to earn selling milk door to door in their first desperate month. Men who had once leaned against the mercantile counter, chuckling about 2 fools and 7 half-wild cows, now waited their turn at the fence line, hats in hand, asking if there was room for one more herd. She remembered their laughter still, not with bitterness, but with a strange tenderness, the way one remembers a hard winter once spring finally comes. He widened the lane leading up from the road, packing gravel into the mud so wagon wheels wouldn't sink when the rains finally returned. She kept a ledger by lamplight, marking names, cans, pounds of cheese, columns of numbers that had once seemed impossible and now simply told the truth of what they'd built. Some evenings they barely spoke, too tired for words, but their silences had long since stopped feeling like distance. They had learned, through fences mended and butter churned at midnight, that quiet beside each other was its own kind of conversation. The dry season broke slowly, clouds gathering over the ridge one evening, as though the sky itself had grown weary of holding back. Rain came in a soft, steady hush, not the violent storm they'd once feared, but a gentle mercy soaking into cracked earth. Yet even after the grass elsewhere began to green again, the ranchers kept coming. Trust, once earned, did not evaporate with the first good rain. By the following morning, wagons lined the road before sunrise, their drivers calling greetings instead of taunts, exchanging empty cans for full ones, warm bread for cold butter, coin for cheese wrapped in cloth. The barn they had once patched with borrowed nails now stood proud and freshly whitewashed, the dairy house beside the stream humming with quiet industry. 7 cows had become dozens, grazing across a meadow deliberately fed by love, sweat, and stubborn hope. At dusk, when the last wagon rolled away down the lane, Evelyn and Lucas stood together at the fence, the sky above Clear Fork turning the color of ripe peaches. Below them, lanterns flickered to life in the dairy house, and somewhere in the barn a cowbell rang softly, answered by another. Neither spoke for a long moment, watching the land they had rescued, now returning the favor tenfold. "We had nothing when we came here," she said finally, her voice steady, warmed by memory rather than sorrow. "We had each other," he answered, taking her hand. "That was enough to start." She leaned into his shoulder, watching the mountain stream catch the last light, silver and endless, just as it had been the day they found it. Whatever the future asked of them, they would meet it the way they always had, together, unafraid, and grateful for the life they had built from nothing but faith, labor, and love.